Welcome to Commsverse 2021, everybody, in our session, Lessons Learned, M365 Phone System at Scale. As in the intro, my name is Curtis Johnstone, and we're 4 MVPs from Microsoft, from Canada. And we wanted to talk to you today about our lessons deploying Microsoft 365 Phone System at Scale. And if you're deploying phone system medium to large size, we're hoping you really are able to benefit from our experience. So I work for a company called Quest Software. We're a third-party management ISV. We write some good tools and solutions for managing a lot of things with Microsoft Teams. And as I said, with me are 3 other Microsoft MVPs. I'll turn it over to Michael to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Lameltang. I'm an 8-time Microsoft MVP. I'm currently speaking from Calgary at 4 a.m. Wish we were there in person. I'm an independent consultant, and for the last few years, the majority of my projects have been helping organizations and partners roll out enterprise voice in Microsoft Teams. I also work with Teams Extensibility and Viva, and I have a condition that requires me to own every Teams certified endpoint. You would not believe what's off camera. And a lot of the content in today's session, it comes from the external architect advisor mindset, where what is the lowest common denominator to move, rinse, and repeat these large voice projects, which could have tight timelines because of support renewals on the PBX side, or just getting dial tone to users that don't have access to their office or their handsets. And with that, I'll pass it off.
Hey, everybody. I'm Dino Caputo, also an Office Apps and Services MVP, seven time now. I'm actually the only one located in the Greater Toronto area, in a little town called Oakville. I've been an independent consultant for over 20 years, focusing on all things Microsoft collaboration. I'd like to think of myself as a technical coach, and these days I mainly focus on Skype to Teams upgrades and doing large-scale voice, enterprise voice customer migrations. First time presenting at this event, and I wanted to thank our hosts and sponsors for having us.
Yeah, and I'm Habib Manko. I'm based out of Ottawa, Canada, just like Curtis is. I'm also an independent consultant for about 10 years now. And as a lot of the guys, I focus a lot on the Skype to Team upgrades, but in the last few years, I've been also focusing on just the greater Microsoft 365 ecosystem, including anywhere from security compliance to device management as well. So happy to be here with everyone.
All right, thanks, Habib. So as I mentioned, us 4, we run a podcast called O365Eh.com. They're short, bite-sized podcast segments focused on a very specific topic. So please feel free to head on over and watch one of our podcasts. So on to what we want to talk to you today about. We have a few things we want to cover, which includes demos, not just PowerPoints. And collectively, each one of us has an area of expertise in deploying phone system. For me, my expertise is more around the PowerShell part of it, managing the phone system settings, policies, configuration at scale. So I'll talk to you a bit about that. But we're going to cover the whole life cycle of deploying the M365 phone system, right from discovery, pre-deployment planning, onboarding, and then we'll wrap it up with some hard-fought lessons learned that we're hoping will really save you some time when you go to do this at scale. We only have 40 minutes. We're cramming a lot into one session, so we'll go fast, but we'll do our best to cover all the bases. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dino to talk about the discovery process, which is really the first step when you start to plan your enterprise deployment.
Awesome. Thanks, Kurt. So an important start to any good project is to perform the appropriate discovery. We really can't solve for what we don't know. So you won't have good success if we don't take the time up front to gather information relevant to helping you deploy phone system at scale. So what exactly should we be considering here? So we'll spend some time covering off the 3 phone system options available to you and what you need to think about for each of those. Get into a bit of the licensing talk, and then I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk about data collection. And so the intent today is really not to get into each of these options in terms of what they all are, but rather to to consider what you need to gather in terms of the information so that you can achieve success at scale. And don't think about excuse me, leaving early, as Michael's got some juicy demos to show off when we get into data collection. So stick around. So before we get into some of the details, it's important to review the options you have with deploying phone system. And that's calling plans, direct routing, and the new kid on the block called Operator Connect. So you wouldn't want to go too far down the path of any one of these until you kind of review all the pros and cons and vetted each one of them. Or even if one of the options makes sense for your organization, you need to consider all of these things before you get too far down the path. So while we won't get into which option might be best suited for your particular project, we're going to focus on the tips and tricks from the field that'll allow you to do these things at scale. So again, whether you decide on calling plans, direct routing, or Operator Connect, or even a combination of these things, make those decisions far enough in advance of starting your journey so that you can achieve success. So let's dig in, starting with calling plans. If your organization is planning to leverage calling plans, it's going to be like buying a new house. And as the saying goes, location, location, location. So, calling plans require that every single phone number you assign to a user has been validated, and that has a validated location, meaning the address is an actual civic address. So it's important that we understand where people are going to be making calls from, and that you've grabbed a list of all these addresses. This is going to be for 911, or in the UK, as you refer to them as 999 or 111, 112 purposes. So it's important that you consider all these users and what physical address you're going to use for their emergency location. Take the time to consider this, especially now during a pandemic where many people are working from home. While it might technically be correct to just assign everybody to the head office location, from an emergency standpoint, emergency services perspective, it won't satisfy things like Kerry's Law and Ray-Baum's Act in the US, for example, which aim at improving the location information that service providers receive when someone calls 911. Next, we'll need to consider number allocations. How many different rate centers do you need phone numbers in? Does Microsoft even provide a phone number in the rate centers for which your users are in? And if they do, can you even get enough of these numbers for all your users? So if the answer to the last 2 questions were no, then you need to consider porting your numbers to Microsoft. So up next, we have Operator Connect, which is a new service currently in public preview. And no, this doesn't have anything to do with the old school operator connecting your call at the switchboard using the wires, but rather the operator is the PSTN carrier or the telco, and the connect term refers to connecting said carrier directly into the Microsoft cloud. So think of it as this service is calling plans, except you are purchasing your DIDs and service from one of the certified carriers instead of Microsoft. So today there's currently 11 different telcos in Operator Connect offering service to over 40 countries. And like calling plans, you don't need to buy any hardware to utilize this service. Like calling plans, you do need to carefully consider your emergency locations, as these will be required when assigning bids to your users. So consider the allocation of numbers and what location the user resides in when doing all your discovery and planning. And on the topic of emergency locations, it's super important to ensure all your emergency locations have been validated. There's a process you go through when you create these addresses and Microsoft validates them. And you need to make sure that they're actually working. I often see a failure when attempting to assign phone numbers to previously validated locations. It might say validated, but it actually isn't. And unfortunately, the fix is to remove and re-add the address and allow it to revalidate. So make sure you at least are able to assign one phone number to each location, to a user in each location before you get too far down the path. So if calling plans or Operator Connect isn't the right approach for you, then you're left with direct routing, which essentially lets you bring your own carrier to Teams. So with direct routing, you need to think about whether you need a physical SBC or session border controller or use a virtual one. Or even if you need one at all, I like to follow the rule that if there isn't a hard requirement for an SBC on-prem, then don't deploy one. There are many vendors now offering direct routing as a service, which save you the pain of having to set up an SBC and maintain it. Of course, if you're connecting to an existing PBX, you'll have to use a certified SBC to do this. I worked on a very large enterprise customer, helping them upgrade from Skype to Teams, and they were 30,000 users, half of which were using PSTN voice. And they were using traditional SIP trunks with SBCs, hardware SBCs deployed on-prem in multiple data centers. Instead of following suit with Teams, we used direct routing as a service and eliminated all these SBCs, which significantly simplified the deployment effort, given the complexity was reduced. We still achieved redundancy through the actual telco, the direct routing as a service provider, and the customer saved a lot of money in operating expenses, as well as shortening the time to the deployment. In terms of complex network deployments, what I'll say on this is it's best, the best Teams user experience comes down to the quality and location of the internet egress points on your network. So the closer the client is to getting onto the Office 365 network, the better chance you have to get good voice quality in PSTN calls and even in meetings and everything else. If there's one tool I can't stress enough, it's connectivity.office.com, which when you go to that site, you can get it to run almost 700 tests from a client perspective, and it'll let you know about any challenges or issues you'll face using all things Office 365 and including Teams. So check it out. It's a super valuable tool. With respect to voice routing, you'll need to map out all your different voice routes. The trick here is to create as few as possible to achieve what you're looking for. With direct routing as a service, I often see carriers configure a simple voice route, which all calls are sent through. When you get into multiple geographies and more complex deployments, you'll need to consider how you want certain phone calls to route out specific SBCs. This doesn't need to be overly complicated, so just do as much as necessary to meet all your requirements. The same thing would go for dial plans. In fact, a lot of the times you can get away without even creating a dial plan in your tenant, as the Teams phone system tenant defaults will always attempt to normalize numbers to the full E164, which is required and all supported carriers will expect. So unless you need to do something fancy with translating extensions into full telephone numbers, you won't likely have to do anything with dial plans and Teams. One thing I will say, and this goes back to location, is to make sure you properly set the user's location and phone system, or location in Office 365. His phone system will use the built-in dial plans to normalize that number to E164. So if you go and do a get CS dial plan, you'll see like 251 pre-configured normalization rules in Office 365 and Teams. And all of these can be used to normalize numbers when making calls. So just be aware of that. Next, on to everybody's favorite topic, licensing. First off, be sure you have the appropriate licensing available. This might require discussions with a licensing specialist to ensure you're getting the most value for your money. While it might be tempting just to buy an E5 because it has everything, If you're not leveraging everything it offers, you're likely spending more money than necessary. The number one problem I see with moving to Teams at scale is related to licensing. If the user is lacking the appropriate licenses, it'll result in failed migrations or lack of functionality when it's expected. So you might have the available license, but it wasn't applied to the user. Give it up to 24 hours and sometimes longer during COVID. So the best advice is to license well ahead of your actual migrations. I always do migrations on Friday nights, so I tend to assign licenses earlier in the week. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michael, who's going to cover off pre-deployment planning.
Thanks, Dino. Yes. So as we look into moving into pre-deployment planning, I'll talk about mastering the art of Excel and PowerShell generation. We'll talk about how to tackle some of the limitations with Microsoft 365 user notification and importing tips. Okay, so we have 4 Teams MVPs presenting on this call, and we're going to be talking about Excel. Sure, you can leverage SQL or Microsoft Lists or Power BI, but everyone has Excel, and with little effort, I've enabled countless users across many organizations, all powered by spreadsheets. So regardless if you're deploying calling plans, Operator Connect, or direct routing, when you're working at scale, you're going to be leveraging PowerShell. So shortly, I'll show you a sample worksheet with some of my tricks to create PowerShell one-liners needed for these projects. At a high level, Concatenate is the workhorse. It's mostly my most important Excel function. I've been using this trick for over a decade to change SMTP addresses or SIP addresses for users, enabling enterprise voice from Link to Teams and everything between. And really, it's what allows that simple PowerShell one-liner generation. I'm going to say it's way better than creating scripts and reading CSV files and creating the correct output and error checking, reestablishing sessions when you may not have access to the environment or the ability to test. Text to columns replace is really using for data cleansing if you get dumps from like Call Manager or some other system. Filter if errors. Conditional formatting is really to scope down the data, focus on porting dates, migration waves, meeting specific criteria. X Lookup, which was released last year. I'm not sure how anyone ever used Excel before X Lookups. I mean, VLOOKUP is trash. Data types, also released last year, and Power Query really has changed how I use Excel in these projects. And last but not least, pivot tables. Great for auditing users without enterprise voice, missing licenses, and calling plans. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So because it was easy, I used to run some PowerShell commands or scripts to dump data to a CSV, maybe get a CSV export from the customer, then copy the data into a sheet and spend a bunch of time, data cleansing, build a whole PowerShell generation workbook. Everything is perfect. And then next I know the customer sends me another export or based on some activities or action items, hey, these users don't have licensing. They start to make some changes and the data starts to drift. So a great PowerShell script for licensing, if you go O365reports.com, I like to make a conscious effort now not to touch the source data and build rules that can be applied over and over as the data changes. So example is, grab licensing of all your users. So this is a great script. We'll dump all the license features that users have. I can keep running this throughout the project. And so how I use this is I basically will use the Excel get data function and I pull from file and I pull from that CSV. So now I can replace the CSV as I'm going throughout my project, pull it into my document, apply any data cleansing. And so how I do this is once you've connected the data, the source files into Excel, you can actually use Power Query. And so Power Query allows you, in this example, I'm just doing some simple manipulation. I have my source data, I promote the first row to the column headers, I basically changed all the rows into text. Of course, I could add, some additional data manipulation and cleansing, but for my case, this was pretty simple. Okay. See. So I just then take a simple pivot table. This pivot table just says, look for users that are enterprise voice enabled. This could be used to, check if those users have calling plans, and, whatever licenses that you're looking for. Check if they have audio conferencing, if you're going to set the dial or the conference bridge. So as we move into, and so that's an easy way to select the data in. As we move into data tables or data types, this is the same thing. We have a source file here, Power Query as well. Same process. I just basically use get CS online user, dump the whole thing to a CSV. I didn't bother filtering or selecting any of the data. I then promoted the headers. I changed the type to text, but then I use this new function called data type, and I just set it to text. After that, I removed some columns and really just focused on the UPNs. But what this gives us in Excel is this magical little box right here. So if I click on this, I can now start doing things like display name, and you can see all the properties that I dumped from that variable. And then I can go and add, say, enterprise voice enabled, or I can add online voice routing policy. And so now I can start expanding the data to the focus that I care about. I also now can just go in and refresh the data. So now as I change that CSV and add more content, all my views and all my lookups will also automatically update. Let's revert that because I'll be pulling that a few times. Okay. Another example of using these data types. So I've created a simple report. It's using a drop-down to pull from that list of or that data table or data type. So as I refresh the data, the drop-down will expand. If I say I'm going to go pick, or you can see that we actually can use these as variables. So I'm referencing the data type. The formula I have here is just C9, which is this drop-down, and then .enabled. So almost like a PowerShell variable. So if I went in here and just said C9 dot online, C9 dot, and you can see it starts to scope it down, almost like IntelliSense and in some of the ISEs. So now I can decide, okay, online voice routing policy. And we'll do this also for C9 dot line URI. And then what we'll do is go and pick some other user. So now you can see all the data refreshes. If I was to go back into the data table, refresh all, I can see that my list is now longer. I can now select more users from that new data table. So now I can create some crazy custom reports where maybe you compare two users and then you, from those two users, you see what is different between them. Okay. Okay, so now we get into the fun part. So what I do is use X Lookups. So say a customer dumps, gives you a dump of, hey, these are all the display names of our users and they're the phone numbers. Now we have to take this and actually generate some PowerShell. So simple X Lookup, I'm basically, if we can still click on this, I'm going to look at that display name, go back to my data type and look at that, that property of display name. And then I'm going to return the user principal name. And then if I, then I'm going to have a whole bunch of NAs for the data that's not there. If I refresh the data again, you can see that it starts to populate. I can go further with some of the Excel functions. I can say, hey, let's do an X lookup for if this user is licensed. If no value is returned, I don't want the NAs. So I'm going to say yes if it's found, and no if it's not. Use color formatting or conditional formatting. I can decide that I don't want to show anything if it doesn't find an item, and I can just use if error and replace that with no text. So simple Excel formulas, but as we're starting to work our way over, we can start building our criteria of how to generate our PowerShell commands. So I can say, you know, if the user already has a line URI, it doesn't match the spreadsheet reporting. Maybe we had some pilot users testing with fake numbers or temporary numbers. You know, do we have a number that's been defined? Do we have, you know, the UPN? And as we work our way through, we're going to basically generate PowerShell one-liners. And again, all these formulas you just create on the first row and then drag and drop. You could just grab this little corner at the bottom, goes down as far as you want, you know, hundreds of rows, thousands of rows, however you want. But the real power here is concatenate. So if we double click on this one, we'll look. So all I'm doing in this formula is saying, you know what, if the user has a phone number and we have a UPN, then we're going to do our concatenate function. And so what I'm doing is basically pulling the UPN and the phone number, populating a set CS user. I'm adding a write output, and I'll talk about that later. And then I'm generating these one-liner PowerShell commands. So now I can highlight hundreds of rows, thousands of rows, open up PowerShell ISE, authenticate to Teams, throw the commands in, hit play, and it goes off and enables the users. So that's why you add the write output, so I can just see where it's going through the items, because if you put a whole bunch of one-liners into ISE and hit run, it doesn't really give you much feedback unless there's errors or until it completes all the runs. So put a write output at the beginning so you can see where it is. If there's any errors, you can match it to the line. If you have to, you know, reestablish the session and connect back in, then you're kind of good to go. Okay. So with that, I will maybe pass it back to Hub.
Yeah, just bring the presentation up here really quickly. All right, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about end user notifications. So you know, one of the things that that we had to do when Michael and I did a deployment together was, you know, we did a 5,000 user calling plans. We noticed that, you know, there was a couple of requirements for end user notifications. So from the Conference Bridge perspective, when a user gets assigned a license, they automatically get a notification saying that, hey, you have audio conferencing, this is your audio conferencing bridge. So we didn't want to make any changes or send a user another notification around that. But what we wanted to do is modify the user's telephone number, the bridge, Conference Bridge telephone number, to be one where they're actually located. So what we did was we grabbed a number of phone numbers across the country where users were primarily located, and then we used PowerShell to assign that as the default number for their locale. So that was one of the items that we wanted to do and to ensure that, you know, a better user experience from that perspective. The second one was assigning numbers to users. So when we assign the numbers to the users, how would we notify them about their telephone number? So when you do it through the Teams admin center, it's all, you know, there's just a little flag here down at the bottom says email the user the telephone number, but it didn't really scale very well. And then we also had a language requirement. And so what we had to do is we had to send an email in both official languages. So in Canada here, we have both English and French languages that were required. So what we found is that you can enable all the users for telephony and for calling plans without sending them a notification. So that was really good, because then we could focus on creating our own notification and sending it out from there. So what we did is we utilized the spreadsheets that Michael was talking about before, and then we developed a PowerShell function that basically reads from that CSV, and then I created a simple HTML template, which I'm not a HTML developer at all, but I figured my way through it, and essentially what this does is that there's some embedded tags within the HTML template that will be replaced by the content coming from the CSV file. So it'll populate the user's name and the telephone number, and then we had it translated, and then we put the same name and telephone number in the location below. And then the open teams and the ouvrir teams are hyperlinks that will actually launch Microsoft Teams as well. So it's kind of like just a really quick HTML template. I'm sure you can make it like super fancy, like the one that Microsoft sends out, but it was relatively quickly done so that we could, get that requirement completed. So just some things to think about, that we had to sort of think outside the box to try and make some of these happen. But luckily, there was a few scenarios that we could cover. Next thing I want to cover is the porting tips for calling plans. So, when you want to port a phone number, I guess into calling plans, there's a few things that you need to do. Obviously, you want to use the Teams Admin Center to submit a port request. There are some limitations that you can do within the Admin Center itself, and so there's only 1,000. Just under 1,000 numbers that you can actually port. What you also want to do is you want to avoid Fridays after 12 p.m. to be your porting days. Usually you want to try and maybe schedule them for like a Thursday evening, just in the sense that I don't believe and haven't seen that the porting group is available on the weekends. So you want to be able to have a support day, which is basically the Friday in the event that there's an issue that you had, right? And then, so previously to this, you had to actually send in emails if you wanted to port numbers or make some modifications or inventory type changes, to your numbers. So Microsoft has developed a new Power Apps portal. The URL is there. So basically, you would use a new Power Apps portal to create a new case for a new porting request or inventory type change. And, talking about inventory type change, this is where, we've used this sort of trick where if you're looking for like a conference bridge number and that conference bridge number is not available in your city, then what you would do is you would find a user number and grab it and then email or send the request to this case to flip the number from a from a user number to conference bridge. Yeah, and then you'll be able to do new number requests, and then you want to also do a port request for each carrier there as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Michael.
Just in the interest of time, maybe we'll skip this slide and we'll jump to the next one.
Sure.
Yeah. So really quickly, so we could pass it to Kurt. Number management. If you're doing bulk enablement for calling plans or Operator Connect, it's actually harder to do this in PowerShell than direct routing. Numbers need to be in the admin center. Addresses need to be validated. You need city codes to pull numbers from inventory. A lot of the commandlets that you're going to use aren't great for, or they're not defaulted for large quantities. So some of them will have result limits defaulted to 500, 100. So you have to use overrides like first X numbers records or result sizes. Also, the get CS online voice user commandlet doesn't display UPN. It's only display name, object ID, and you have to add additional parameters or switches to get things like emergency address. And we'll flip to the next slide. Great script on GitHub. I believe these slides will be available later, but when Hab and I were grabbing numbers at scale, this is a great script which actually uses outgrid view as an input to the next screen, and you can kind of walk through grabbing your numbers and your locations, and it'll keep updating it all the way down to the local city. So great for us to acquire numbers at scale, bypassing the admin center and going much quicker. We started to pick some of the pre-options and update them in the script, so it was much quicker. But that's how we were able to basically pillage inventory rate setters all over the place as we were grabbing numbers. Jump to the next screen. We also built a monitoring script so that we would monitor when inventory gets replenished, and then we would get an email, and then we would chase the customer down to run the script on the previous screen to steal all the numbers from that inventory. And with that, I'll pass it to Kurt, and we'll see how fast he can dance.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, we're running out of time here, but there's a couple things from a PowerShell perspective I just wanted to cover, because there's some lessons I've learned that you can really get some benefit from and things you need to know about. So when we talk about using PowerShell at scale, tens of thousands, even the hundreds of thousands of objects and users when you're setting those enterprise voice policies, configuring it, what you really want to be mindful of is throttling and delays. So in terms of throttling, what you really have to be aware of is the former Skype for Business online commandlets, which are now rolled into the new Teams PowerShell module. It has a couple of key limitations. One, in terms of maximum concurrent sessions you can have open, that's limited to 3 per credential. And by credential, I mean that's the admin credential you're connecting with in that PowerShell module. And you'll get an explicit hard denial once you hit that 3 session limit. So be very mindful of it. The other thing is you're limited to 10 sessions per tenant. So this can happen. You can hit this limit easily when you're just testing your scripts, or if you've batched your user operations into chunks. So if you're doing something on 10,000 users and you break it to batches of 500, if you have 10 of those running, the 11th one will get a hard denial. The other limitation you need to be aware of is resource limits. And a resource in this context is any object in the cloud essentially that you're taking an action on, like a user or a group. There's basically a limit in terms of how much you can strain that resource, like one type of resource. And you'll see on the slide here the various levels of throttling you'll hit. The first one is you'll get a warning message return, then slower responses, and then finally you'll just get a hard denial. So do batch your operations, but make them big enough so that you don't have too many sessions, and you're not too focused simultaneously on any one resource. So with that, I'll just move on to 2 quick slides. One is a call out to a really good tool that's available in the Microsoft 365 portal, and it's called SelfHelp Diagnostics. And you access this when you go to create a service ticket. And when you go to create the service ticket, it'll ask you what your problem is, and you can enter the specific scenario there. What this does is it runs some tests and diagnostics behind the scenes that some of them you don't even have access to. And it's one of the few tools we found that have accessed the Microsoft backend configuration in the cloud in a way that you can't, to give you some information that'll help you troubleshoot the problem. For example, if the dial pad is missing in calling plans, you can enter the UPN of the user that's having this problem, and it'll check some configuration on the backend service and let you know what the problem is. So a very useful tool. And lastly, I'll just cover Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell is a built-in command line PowerShell console. It's built right into the M365 portal. And this is really useful if you have an enterprise voice deployment where there's a problem installing that PowerShell tool or console on the local machine. This is built in, it's always available, and it runs PowerShell in a virtual container. So you will need an Azure storage account. And it's preloaded with Microsoft Teams PowerShell module. So it's there, it's ready to go. And just a useful tip here, you can't use the consent dialog. There's no ability to pop that up. But if you use, when you launch your session, you can use a parameter called use device authentication. And that'll allow you to authenticate your PowerShell session using a URL and a code, and to avoid that interactive pop-up. So I know that was super, super quick, but we're 1 minute over. Hab, Dino, Michael, any final thoughts before we go?
No, thank you everyone for listening to our session. Sorry we had to cram it in. There was a lot of content.
Yeah. sorry we didn't have time for questions, but I hope that was useful.
Is there any question in the audience? No, everybody's nodding. You sure? Okay, well then we'll thanks for Teams Canada for this presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great conference.